So to continue.
Yes.
So we start now. Okay. Good morning, everybody. The paper I am presenting today is one of my thesis chapters, which looks at farmers' perceptions of risks, uncertainties, and management strategies using psychometric scaling methods. My supervisors are Faye, Michael, and Roy. So before I present the actual paper, I would like to give you a brief overview of my whole thesis. This word cloud shows what my thesis is all about. So it's all about risk in farming, risk perceptions, risk attitude, insurance, farmers' choice, etc. Risk has important implications in farming and overall economy. So in the presence of risk, farmers resort to low risk, low return options, which hampers the agricultural growth. And risk-prone farmers have a very strong preference for status quo, and they are reluctant to adopt new technologies. And risk-prone farmers are less creditworthy, and money lenders are reluctant to finance them. And more importantly, poor farmers who are already in the poverty trap, in the pursuit of avoiding further risk, they often miss the opportunity to escape the poverty trap because they don't get any risk premium. So managing risk is very important. Risk has context-specific meanings, and risk-related terms are widely used in day-to-day life as well. So it's important to clarify what we mean by risk in the context of this thesis. In this thesis, we refer to risk as the possibility of uncertain outcomes. Although uncertainty is itself an integral part of risk, the literature has distinguished risk and uncertainties. Risk is referred to as the situation where probability distribution of uncertain outcomes can be estimated with some accuracy, and uncertainty is the situation when such distribution cannot be known. In general, we often think about risk as a loss kind of things, but literature has both upside and downside risk. Upside risk is the uncertain possibility of gain, and downside risk is the uncertain possibility of loss. In this thesis, we only focus on the downside risk in farming. And there are two important aspects of risk. One is objective risk, which is the actual risk and which can be estimated as the probability and loss of undesirable outcomes. So the estimation of objective risk is limited by the availability of historical data. So individual estimation of risk, that is risk perception, is more important in the context of individual decision making, because people decide based on what they think is going to happen than what happened in the past. So risk perception is the topic of this study. Another important term that appear in my thesis is risk attitude, which is basically individual evaluation of risk in terms of certainty, and it's about individual's utility curve. So from the curvature of utility function, we can derive risk aversion coefficient and categorize the decision makers into risk averse, risk neutral, and risk preferring decision makers. And finally, risk management is another topic of my thesis, which is about taking actions against risk, or sometimes not taking any actions at all. So there can be four possible risk management strategies that are risk retention, risk reduction, risk avoidance, and risk transfer. So risk retention is taking risk, and risk avoidance means avoiding the risky activities at all. And risk reduction means reducing the probability of loss. And risk transfer is the transfer of risk horizontally through insurance. So, and information on risk perception is important, because the applicability of one of these strategies depend on the severity of loss and probability of loss. The insurance is considered ideal for the risks that are low in probability and high in severity of loss. So we examine the farming risk in Nepal based on this matrix, whether they are ideally insurable or not. So this is the overall research framework of my thesis. We have three groups of variables, and we examine the relationship between these three groups of variables. The first group of variables are various factors, socio-demographic factors. And second group of variables are attitudinal factors, such as risk attitude, risk perception, and their willingness to pay for risk reduction. And third group of variables are decision variables, mainly about farm mechanization, crop variety adoption, and risk management strategies. So we adopted a sequential mixed methods research design to achieve four objectives set in this thesis. So the first phase was qualitative research, which employed cognitive in-depth interviews to collect data, and cognitive mapping approach to analyze and present the results. And the qualitative study set a broad context of farming risk in Nepal, and also inform the design of identification of variables and design of study tools for the following quantitative study. And the quantitative part of the study involved psychometric scaling of the farmers' perceptions, a lottery choice experiment to measure their risk attitude, and discrete choice experiment to measure their willingness to pay for crop insurance. So four papers out of this research combinedly contribute to four objectives of this research. And today I'm presenting the paper 2, which contributes to the objective of assessing risk perception and risk management strategies. So southern plain of Nepal, also known as Tarai region, is the study site for this study. So we divided the whole study site into 3 clusters based on amount of annual rainfall. The amount of annual rainfall decreases as we move from east towards west. And we applied multi-stage random sampling technique to select 7 districts, 14 villages within 7 districts, and 30 samples in each village. That makes the final sample size of 420. So now I'd like to present the results of psychometric scaling. First of all, we examine the farmer's perception of source of uncertainties in farming in general. We presented 54 statements representing the sources of risk or uncertainties in farming, and asked them to rate their agreement on this 5-point scale. So based on the mean scale rating, the uncertainties related to output price, increased number of drought days, erratic rainfall, uncertain labor supply, and unstable government support are the top 5 risk factors. And we also ascribe these risk factors to one or more of market, production, institutional, financial, and personal risk. Out of the 54 statements we assist as risk factors in farming, we extracted 8 statements that relate to drought, and 6 factors that relate to a flood to construct a drought vulnerability index and flood vulnerability index. We found that farmers' vulnerability to drought is more higher than the vulnerability to flood, and these indices do not vary across the study clusters. Additionally, we presented the farmers with 18 statements, particularly related to farm mechanization, and asked them to rate their agreement on the same 5-point scale. So based on mean scale rating, the insufficiency of their existing knowledge and uncertain supply of machines and services, the potential return from the purchase of machines, and suitability of their land condition for farm mechanization, and cash requirement to pay for the services and machines were the major downside part of adopting farm mechanization. Similarly, we presented 13 additional statements related to the downside part of adopting a new crop variety, and farmers' perception of potential for losing existing local varieties, the increased seed dependency and increased use of agrochemicals, low adaptability of new crop variety to environmental adversities, and a higher chance of insect and disease infestation were major risk factors associated with the adoption of a new crop variety. To measure farmers' risk experience and perceptions, we presented various risk or undesirable situations in their farming, and asked 4 questions. The first 2 questions were about their experience of risk in the past, and the second 2 questions are their expectation about risk in the future. So we asked how often they how often they experience those risks in last 10 years, and how much was the loss to their income or production when it happened. And we computed risk experience score as a product of the frequency of the risk and the loss in the past. Similarly, we asked them to rate how likely they think the same risk is going to happen in the next crop season, and how much would be the potential loss if it happens, and calculated risk perception score as a product of probability and potential loss. And this bar graph presents top 5 and a few more risk of special interest based on a mean risk perception rating. So the risks associated with labor shortage, price of farm output, drought, production cost, and insect infestation were the top 5 undesirable situations or risk in their farming. And their perception and experience of risk have correlation coefficient higher than 0.5 in each case. So that implies that their experience of risk and perception are correlated. So these figures adjacent to the name of risk indicate the correlation coefficient. These two risks, drought and flood, are of special interest to us because these are major weather-related risks in farming, and crop insurance is feasible and being offered against those risks. So this matrix shows the correlation between risk perception and experience. So as you can see, their perception of risk and experience is correlated for both flood and drought risk, and we generally assume that flood and drought risks are negatively correlated because the objective factors leading to drought and flood are counteractive. But we found the correlation between these two risks, farmers' perception about these two risks are uncorrelated, although the sign is in the expected direction. So we found farmers' perception of drought risk much higher than their perception of flood risk, and we were interested to examine whether what part, either probability part or potential loss part, contributed to that perception. And we found that the perception of drought, high perception of drought risk was both due to their higher perception of probability part and potential loss part. In general, drought is considered low probability, low probability, high probability, low impact risk, and flood is high probability, low probability, high impact risk. But farmers, we found that farmers' perception of drought risk likelihood and loss associated with drought risk is higher. So this has important implications in the design of insurance product against these. Because insurance is considered ideal for low probability, high impact risk. If insurance are to be offered against other type of risk, and there is implications in premium price. So we will discuss that in the next slide. So we can see from this diagram that based on the farmer's perception of loss and probability of both flood and drought risk, these are not ideally insurable. So a risk to be ideally insurable should be around this region. This indicate low probability, high impact risk. So farmers' willingness to pay for the insurance against the risk here may be low, and the insurance providers may charge high premium price for the risk that fall within this region. So in both cases, there may be high gap between farmers' willingness to pay and insurance providers' willingness to sell. So that gap may need to be overcome through insurance subsidy. So we were, since flood and drought risk are the major weather-related risk, we were interested to examine what factors might explain those risks. So we estimated a Tobit model of their perception of drought and flood risk. but we only found a few variables explaining these risks. As we can see, their drought risk perception increases as the family size increases, and if they are migrant households, and their perception drought risk perception decreases with the increase in their age, and if they have access to infrastructure and services. And their perception of flood risk was significantly affected only two factors. This migration status has a positive effect on perception of both risks. And interestingly, we also found that farmers' awareness of stress-tolerant rice varieties also increased their perception of flood risk, which is counterintuitive. So one possible reason for this result might be that so far the use of stress-tolerant rice varieties is very low, and the awareness of the availability of such varieties might have alerted them about the possibility of such risks happening. And finally, we assist the farmers' prioritization of the various risk management strategies. We presented the farmers with 43 risk management strategies and asked them to rate how often did they apply the strategy in last 10 years, and how effective was the strategy when they applied it in overcoming income or yield loss on both on 5-point scales, and computed importance score multiplying these two ratings. And this bar graph shows the major strategies identified by the farmers. So looking at these top strategies, farmers prioritized one farm risk management strategies, and they gave market-based strategies such as purchase of crop insurance and forward contract as low important strategies. To the follow-up questions, we also found that at this stage, farmers' awareness about the availability of market-based risk management product is very low. That might be the reason for them to rate these strategies in the, lower in the list. So to conclude, we found that farmers have high perception of uncertainties in farming in general, and in particular in varietal adoption and farm mechanization. This might be the main reason for slow adoption of new technology in developing countries like Nepal. Farmers perceived that the uncertainties associated with in labor supply, output price, and drought are the major risk. Farmers' vulnerability and perception of flood is drought is higher than flood risk, and the perception of drought and flood risk are uncorrelated, and some farmers have high perception of both. So the extension and risk management support program designed assuming that a farmer that has a high perception of drought risk does not have low perception of flood risk may leave some farmers unbenefited from the interventions. And risk experience and risk perception are positively correlated. This has methodological implications. Stating what we experienced in the past is cognitively much easier than stating the future expectations. So since these two constructs are correlated, we can researchers can use risk experience as a proxy of risk perception, especially in the context where the respondents have low education or low cognitive ability. Contrary to the general assumption, we found that drought is a higher likelihood, high impact risk, and flood as the low frequency, low impact risk. So, and both are not ideally insurable. So, if insurance is to be provided against this risk, there should be special consideration on premium, deciding premium rate and subsidy levels. And farmers' high prioritization of on-farm risk diversification strategies indicate a low demand for insurance, and information on that some factors, these factors affect farmers' perception of risk, can be helpful in identifying the target group for risk management product and policy interventions. So with this, I conclude my presentation, and thank you for bearing with me. So, questions and suggestions for the improvement of this.
Ben? So, can we?
This
Mic is on.
Yeah, you can just talk from here.
Can I ask, we give the first question to one of our postgrad students? We want to encourage conversation, not from ourselves. Someone want to pose a question? Anything?
You mentioned something I didn't fully understand the other day. So you said something about proxies in economics not always being tested, but then just it might be more of a question to Steve. But so if you're saying that the risk proxy, the past risk can be a proxy for future risk, does that? Tried. Sorry.
So I just mean that if we ask somebody to state what happened in the past, it's cognitively much easier and the data has less noise.
Yeah.
And the data on future expectation might be more noisy. So if both of these are correlated, and in the context of the respondents that have lower cognitive ability, we better use their experience rather than expectation to to infer the risk perception. That's what I mean to say.
Yeah. And then does that even make that a good proxy? You're saying that sometimes it's bad proxies.
I wasn't thinking that in that kind of context.
Yeah.
What drives it here is the relatively high level of correlation that's being picked up, having asked both questions.
Yeah.
The other aspect is sometimes experience is historical. If the data is up there, you can use directly. That's the way this positive correlation, you don't have to engage extra collecting data efforts, perception engage. That's the some extra. Yeah. We have this.
Just query. In your study, you have collected information about farmers' perception and this, right?
Yeah.
Like drought and flood. Have you ever also said those perceptions are somewhat reflecting the reality based on weather data?
Yeah, we used the objective risk factors as well in the regression model, but that appeared to be non-significant. We constructed vulnerability indices, but we didn't. That's again farmers' perception of the vulnerability is not the real vulnerability based on historical data.
And then follow-up, what's the pattern of perceptions across geographically? You talk about rainfall.
Yeah, that's
Does that match?
the geographical location doesn't have any effect. Yeah, the grayed out variables don't have significant effect.
There's no spatial pattern in
Yeah.
perceptions,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
you might have expected given.
yeah.
what
We
you see
expected,
about
yeah.
Then is what you
My question being asked.
Okay, and then maybe Mary first and then Brad.
Easy, lots of questions. Easy question. You talk about the perceptions of flood risk and drought risk.
Yeah, yeah.
How does it relate to the actual observed occurrence of floods and droughts in that region?
So we didn't actually examine that because such data are not available for specific for the regions.
But you will have information about floods in Nepal or droughts in Nepal. And I'm just interested because you make the statement that droughts are perceived as lower risk or a higher risk than floods. Well, but maybe there are more droughts than floods. So
The clustering we did was basically based on that objective risk factors, based on amount of annual rainfall, which is the main source of both drought and flood risk. Yeah, and that distribution of rainfall has a special pattern that the amount of rainfall decreases as we move from east towards west, but that doesn't have effect on perception.
Surprising. That's a little bit surprising because if you look at that's the convention, that's the way people believe. If you go from east to west, both drought and rainfall. West is dry. Even if fewer days of drought will have significant impact on the west compared to the east, and east is very wet. So that's quite interesting. Okay, if you're done, I have a number of questions, but I will go back to one of your slides where you showed past experience and future perception. From the same point of view, thinking about drought and flood, why farmers are perceiving that the future look better than the past? Because all of your bars indicate that perception score is lower than the experience score.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what's going on in farmers' mind that the future will be brighter than the past. Sorry, it might be maybe you need to think about it, but it suggests me that their perception of risk of all of those variables look like except the land price deflation, which is except that one. From almost all of them. It's a better scenario in the future.
Might be indication of a good place to go for vacation and all happy people.
But the reality might be suggesting the other way around. Well, think about that. The other question I had is, okay, I might have forgotten. What was it? Let's start it
Maybe the people in Nepal are very positive people.
I remember. I'll come back to that. I think the situation is deteriorating in both rainfall-wise, drought-wise. That's the experience of us. And your question about the data, I don't know on top of my head, but the data is suggesting in that direction, I believe. So in that sense, these farmers are saying, oh, we used to have very good days and more days, and now we are not getting rainfall as much as we used to. Winter rainfall is a particular example in place, particularly in the West. It has been heavily impacted because of lack of winter rainfall. So I think perhaps the observations might be your sampling or farmers who are responding. Maybe think about that. The other thing I was wondering is when you are thinking about the risk, so many different factors affect risk, but did you consider the political factor in your 54 different statements? Anywhere, to this sense, politics in the country is a risk factor for these farmers.
We included some institutional
Mhm.
statements, but not exactly the political ones.
Because oftentimes we see that farmers are discarding their product because of the political unrest, and it has been happening for very many years. And farmers might have developed that idea that okay, having a stable government or a slight different system would help us because they are losing their product, they are losing money. That's what they experience.
So instability of government support in the market was one of the factors, but not exactly the political.
When I say that, the blockade, they block the roadways for a week, and farmers have to discard their product on the street. So I think maybe think about that, because I would argue that the political and that sort of environment is also quite a significant factor for them to consider whether they are going to prosper with agriculture. Actually,
Yeah, that's good.
I just have maybe one point and one question. I'm not sure I heard what is your research program or what is your objective, because just provided a big scenario about risk, then you went ahead to talk about your data and then the results. So I think maybe I missed it, but did you define what is the research program or what is the objective of that paper, second paper? If you would have presented that, that would make things more clear. Then there's a figure where you have about risk vulnerability. I did not understand what is the definition of risk vulnerability in this context. I think there's somewhere you have a risk vulnerability. Yeah. So when I look at this and I look at the questions that you are, number of drought days has increased. Okay, so what is the definition of vulnerability in the context of what you're trying to do here?
We assume that these 8 statements represent or these factors lead to the drought risk, and these 6 statements lead to flood risk, and we combined the statements to have a vulnerability score.
So what's the definition of vulnerability? Of course, risk and vulnerability are 2 different things.
They are more prone to drought if they have high agreement on these statements.
Is there an average?
Yeah, we did average. We tried to do this using factor analysis and alpha method, but scale reliability coefficient were low. That's why I ended up using average.
For purpose of clarity, maybe it's good if you can define clearly what you mean by vulnerability. Because still, when I look at that, I don't understand how that represents vulnerability. Maybe what's your working definition of vulnerability in the context of what you're trying to do?
We simply mean that they have a high chance of facing those flood if they have high vulnerability to flood.
The perceived concept, right?
Yeah, perceived vulnerability.
We've labeled it vulnerability, but it's not sure that that would be the right term. What you've done, maybe it's something else. It's vulnerability in the literature. It's well established, and it's particular measurements. And this is different.
So vulnerability would mean what is the likelihood that they are going to be exposed to risk? Then that would be vulnerability. But the way you're defining it, still the demarcation between then what you're defining as risk and vulnerability is not quite clear.
That is the threshold level, and whether you are very close to the threshold or away from it. That's how you are likely to be highly vulnerable if you are very close to that threshold. In poverty literature, they talk quite heavily about that concept. I think that's how
Okay, the last one, I think, the one of the tables, I think, both in perception, we found that labor shortage is high